Okay, so picking up where we left off last time, we're going to talk about UV optimization and menu layout. And this is going to get a little more advanced, so bear with me as we go through this, and pause the video, rewind it, watch it as many times as you need in order to get the concept, because if you're serious about 3D modeling, you're going to be doing a lot of this. So I need to create a material for this bottle that we can use. Let me close that end menu to visualize my UV layouts in a meaningful way compared to what's happening in this window over here. So we need to connect these, because right now this is just gray and so is this, and it's kind of difficult to make sense of what's up and what's down. Now, if you're working in a procedural workflow for texturing or something like that, this sort of thing would be fine. It's a little unoptimized, but you could get away with doing something like this, and then using something like Substance Designer, Substance Painter, Quixel Mixer, something like that, to kind of texture your stuff procedurally, and it'll work. The other thing we could do is we could paint directly on this bottle in, again, Substance Painter or here in Blender, and not worry too much about this UV layout and get it to work the way we want it to. But again, we want to know what's going on and have control over this, because we're going to manually create our textures. We need to be paying attention to what's actually happening in our UV layout. So let me show you how we do that. So the first thing that we want to do is head over here with our bottle selected, of course, to our material properties settings in the properties tab. And we're going to hit new, and we're going to see that we have a material over here now that's applied to the bottle. I'm going to call this tonic because it's the material for the tonic. And then you can see we have a number of properties here. I understand that this is a lot of information and can get overwhelming relatively quickly, but don't worry, I'm going to walk you through the important parts and we'll go from there. So right now I'm going to add a new window here. Just drag this up, making sure everything's still selected. And then I'm going to change the editor type to a shader editor. And you can see here, let me just close the side panel with the N key. You can see here, if I move this so you can see the screencast keys, it's not that important that we have everything selected, just so that we have we can see everything in the UV window. That's why I said have everything selected. You can see here we have this principled BSDF linked to our material output. This is the same thing that we're seeing over here. You can see under the surface in our material properties tab, we have the principled BSDF, and we have a whole bunch of settings. I'm going to tell you, don't worry about a lot of this stuff. We're going to concern ourselves with the base color right here. So what we want to do with this base color, we could either do this in the shader node network here, or we could do it right here with this button. I'm going to do it with this button because it's a little easier. I'll teach you how to do it over here later on when we get into baking and things like that. So to start, we're going to click this yellow button here, and we're going to look for texture, image texture, and we're going to click that, and you'll see that it's created something over here. Don't worry about that. We're going to look over here where it's added this new option in, and we're going to say new, and then we're going to call this tonic underscore UV grid with a capital G, and we're going to make sure that this texture is set to a width and height of 1024 pixels by 1024 pixels. That is a square image similar to what we're seeing here. And generally speaking, when you're doing texture generation for materials and UV layouts and things like this, you want to work in powers of 2. So that's 2, 4, 6, 8, 16, 24, or 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024, 2048, 4096, etc. You'll see those commonly when you're talking about downloading textures or working with textures. So we're working with 1024, which is a power of 2. It's just something you get used to as a 3D artist, okay? We're going to turn off alpha, and we're going to say generated type. We're going to switch it from blank to UV grid, and that's going to be really useful for us. We're going to say okay, and you can see here that we have now a UV grid in our UV layout, which is going to be very helpful for us getting our bearings about what's actually happening on the surface of our 3D model. The way we can visualize that up here is to switch our shading mode. Currently, we're in solid viewport shading mode. It says display in solid mode. We want to switch over to viewport shading for display in material preview mode. And there we go. We can see that. The alternative way to do this, the quick way, is to be in the 3D edit window and hit Z on the keyboard and click material preview. All right. So now what we can do is we can minimize this. We're going to come back to that later, but now we want to look at it, and you can see that there's a lot of distortion and warping with our UV layout, and that's because of the way that this has been laid out. So with the label, however, it's nice and even. You have nice squares that are evenly laid out. That's the ideal. That's what we want. We do, however, need to make sure that we're oriented properly. And I can see immediately that we're not. And the reason I can tell that is we want to orient ourselves in 3D in a meaningful way. So when I hit the 1 key, that's the front view. And you can see that the red x-axis runs left and right, and the green one runs forward and back. And there's an invisible blue one that runs up and down. You can see that over here in this little widget that you can see. And basically what we want is to check that on this left side. If you can imagine unfolding this side flat and then also unfolding this side flat, we should see a yellowish green plus sign or crosshair on the leftmost side here, and we don't. We see a purple one, which we're seeing on the right side. So that means that this is flipped. It's inverted. So what I want to do is click off of this so nothing is selected and hit the L key while hovering over this UV island or shell inside my UV editor. And I'm going to hit SX, not SZ, but SX -1 and hit enter. And now we can see that here we have this kind of a pinkish magenta looking crosshair here, and it's also over here. At the bottom we have the more violet purple one, and then on the right side we have this green yellow, and at the bottom just the yellow. And now it corresponds properly. One thing that I didn't mention in the previous modeling is when we have the whole model selected, we should hit Shift N. And what that does is it recalculates the normals. What that means is the direction which the surface of our polygons are facing. We can visualize this in the overlays here by opening this up in our viewport overlays, finding normals and clicking this button here. If we hover over it, it says display face normals as lines. And you can see here we get all these little fuzzy lines that indicate the direction that this face is pointing in. We just want to make sure that they're all pointing out. If they're pointing inside, we can get all sorts of issues with shading and problems like that. So we're going to let them point out like that, and then I'm going to toggle that back off. If you do run into shading errors, make sure to check that. So now that the label is taking up a good amount of space and it's oriented properly, let's start orienting the rest of our 3D model properly in terms of UV. So at the top, we're going to click on here, and I'm going to hit L, and you can see that we get this part, and it's kind of rotated funny. So I'm going to hit 7 on the keyboard to get a top view. And you can see here it's pretty flat from how we're looking at it. I'm going to tap U on the keyboard in the 3D, what is this called exactly? The 3D viewport, that's what it is. I keep calling it the 3D editor. And it is an editor, but it's the 3D viewport. Anyways, now that we have a top view, I'm going to hit the U key and we're going to say project from view bounds. And what that's going to do is it's going to reproject this UV shell from the view of our camera, and it's going to size it up to the bounds of the UV space. Now, let me explain something about this UV space for a second. This square is typically called the 0 to 1 UV space. And what that means is this coordinate down here is 0, 0, because it's a 2D image, not 3D like this. So that's 0, 0. And then we move over it, that's 1, 0. So 1 in the X, 0 in the Y. And then up here is 0, 1, so that's 0 in the X and 1 in the Y. And then in this corner, we have 1, 1. So that's 1 in the X and 1 in the Y. Anything that falls outside of the 0 to 1 space is either going to be tiled, so it's going to be a repetition of the image. So this point over here and anything that occurs here is also going to occur over here, and then at the same interval from 0 to 1, and then from 1 to 2, and 2 to 3, etc., tiling infinitely in this direction, and then in this direction, as well as the negative directions as well. So you can imagine that if you were to take whatever image, so this grid image, it would be duplicated left and right. So if I took this entire shell and I shifted it, look, it's just the same texture no matter where I go. So I'm going to right click and leave it there. And so that's what it's doing, is it's projecting it to the bounds of the 0, 1 space. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to scale this down. And the reason why I did that is because I like my UV shells to be consistent and non-rotated. So that way, again, I can organize them in a meaningful way. And then if I need to rotate them later, I can do that. And so here's the part where I'm going to teach you to manually manipulate your UV shells. And this video is going to be a little bit longer on account of that. I may also go through and speed this up later on, and I'll call that out. So the next one we want to do is this part of the cap. And so this is where it gets a little tricky. So I'm going to select this rectangular section because it looks flat, and I'm going to say U unwrap, and this is the part that we're going to be repeating a lot. You can see now it's unwrapped into a perfect rectangle or a seemingly perfect rectangle. It's close enough to what I want. You can see here that all of these squares are pretty consistent, and we no longer have this sort of diagonal tilted look to it, and that's something we want to avoid. We want all of our squares to look just like this or similar to this, but on the rest of our model as well, and so I'm going to teach you how to manually do that. So now that we have unwrapped this one face that's flat manually, I can hit the L key while hovering over it and get the rest of this, but in the 3D viewport, I'm going to hit U and say follow active quads and say OK at average length. And this is a nice little tool that allows us to unwrap everything and get these nice even squares. So there are some add-ons that allow us to do this sort of automatically, and it's worth investing in them. I have a couple of them. But at least in the meantime, we can do this manually. And of course, there's going to be a little bit of warping here and there when we have some slanted parts. Something like this can be avoided if we were to add in a subdivision surface modifier like this. You see, as soon as I add some extra stuff, it kind of straightens itself out. But again, that's kind of one of the trade-offs that we have for working with a lower res model and also getting rid of any deformation in the UV layers by straightening everything out using that method that I just showed you. And then let's see here. I want to rotate this like this by intervals to -90 degrees. If you look in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, you see it says rot -90. And I'm holding down Control to get it to snap to increments of 5 degrees until it's -90. And now I can take a look at this seam that we've created. And the leftmost one, if I move it onto here, the leftmost one should have a indigo. Let's move it over even more. Okay, so the leftmost one has cyan, and the rightmost one also has cyan, but they look like they are in the proper locations, so that big a deal. There we go. And so now it's nice and even squares, just like we had anticipated. Now we're going to do this for the rest of the model. I'm not going to belabor the point by making you watch all of that. This one is already straightened out for us because it's not deforming in any way. This one is going to be a bit of a pain. So I'm going to show you how I did this again using this little donut thing. And then for the rest of the model, I'm just going to speed it up just because I don't want to make you watch that. But essentially what I have to do here is select one face and hit unwrap. And you'll notice that it doesn't unwrap as a perfect square. And that's because this is slanted. It's not a completely flat surface. So it's best to do this with flat surfaces, but we can fix it. So let's grab these right vertices and I'm going to hit S for scale, holding down Shift. And I'm just going to scale these until they look like they are perfectly flush with their left counterparts, and then I'm going to grab both of these and say SY0, so we're scaling them in the Y direction, which is up and down, so X is left and right, Y is up and down, and we're snapping them to 0 so that they're perfectly parallel with one another, SY0, and there we go. Now we have, if we look at this face here, and the way I did that was I pressed the number pad 0, you can see here we have our nice little perfect squares, and then what I can do is hit the L key over the top of it, and so that leaves the square selected, and then we have the other selection underneath it. And then we're going to say U and say follow active quads and hit OK. And there we go. It is nice and square all over. Let's select this whole thing, scale it down, move it back into the 0, 1 space. And then now I'm going to rotate this holding down Control, and I'm going to look for the left side. We're going to look for the seam in our 3D window. And I know this is a bit complicated. It's a lot to deal with. And let's see, in the top left-hand corner, this face right here corresponds to this red crosshair. So there we go. So again, minor deformations here and there. Again, if we added more geometry, it would solve that. But that's essentially how you create nice square UV layouts on cylindrical objects. So for this last one, I'm just going to do it. I'm going to speed through it. And, you can take your time and rewatch what we saw before and, do your best. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down in the comment section. I am just going to just quickly go through this. All right, and there we go. So now you can see our bottle definitely has more of an even distribution of those squares that are laid out. in a meaningful way, and they are much more square, much more even. It's looking pretty good. I'm going to take this whole thing and I'm going to say UV, just selecting the whole thing with A, UV, and say average island scales. And that will also help to even out the distribution of those UVs. And then I can also say UV pack islands, and that's going to pack them. But I want to open this up and turn off rotate so that it doesn't rotate our circular areas here. I do, however, want to take this one, which I believe is these faces right here, and I do want to rotate those. And I need to check on the inside of the model. There's a little bit of zooming and things like this, and see which one's where. So this one looks like it's rotated in the wrong direction because this is our left side, this is our right side, but our left side is showing the yellow one and our right side is showing the cyan one. So that's not correct. So I'm going to say R180. And now you can see that the yellow one is on the left, just like here, and the cyan one is on the right. And let's make sure that as I move this, it moves up and down. Perfect. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Select the whole thing, get that going. And then we'll do the same thing. We'll select the whole thing, UV, and say average island scale, and then pack islands. That's looking pretty good. We have rotate turned off, and I'm just going to say 0.02. That looks pretty good, or even maybe 0.01 in my margin, so I get a little bit of space in between here. Actually, I want 0.02 just to have a little more. And that essentially is going to make sure that when we create our texture, we're not overlapping stuff inside of here. Now, one thing that should be noted is I want to dedicate more texture space to the label than the rest of the bottle. So what I need to do is I need to grab my label, and I need to just scale this up. And you'll notice that the UV squares get a little bit smaller. I'm just going to save that really quickly with the Control S. And that's because we have more detail on this than we do on the rest of the bottle. In fact, I'm going to hit UV and I'm going to say pack islands, and that's going to pack it so it spans across the entire thing. Again, with a 0.02, so we got a 0.02 margin from the edge of the composition to that. Then select the whole thing and say UV pack islands again, and then that's going to give us a good amount of space to fill this up with. And now I can kind of mess with the amount of space that I'm giving to each of these individual components. So maybe these need to scale up a little more. Grab this again and hit pack islands. And I don't want to vary these too much because it'll work with the label because it's not connected with the mesh. But any of the parts that are connected together, you don't want to have too much of a variation between them, because you'll notice that with certain textures, especially tiling textures, that certain parts will appear larger and smaller. Now, what this is referring to is somewhat of a complex idea known as texel density. It's similar to pixels, but it's like three-dimensional related pixels as they're projected onto a mesh. And so we want to keep our texel density relatively even across our model. It doesn't have to be perfect. And when we work with game models, sometimes we kind of push the texel density. We can have a smaller, a less dense of an area for texels on geometry that's not going to be seen in the game as much. So things that are hidden, things that are not viewed as directly, we can kind of get away with giving them less space on the UV map. Whereas things that are going to be seen close up, things that need to have a lot of detail, such as the label, for example, we want to make sure that those things get viewed very largely and that we can see them clearly. Again, there are some tools that help us calculate texel density, some additional add-ons for things like this that are very useful. I personally have bought and used plenty of these and do use them in my regular workflows, so I would highly recommend that if you're serious about getting into game design or 3D modeling, to look into some of those. So here I'm just going to start to play with this packing algorithm. Again, I have something else that tends to work better than this when I use, in my own work, but because I know not everyone has access to that, I'm going to omit showing that simply for the sake of making sure that people can do this without needing to go and buy relatively expensive things. Now we're getting pretty close to having a good layout. I'm actually going to take these and scale them up a little bit and say, because actually, let me undo that. I want all three of these. So here, if I hit L and say delimit by normal, it'll select the whole thing. So now I can kind of scale this up, and because I want this entire bottle, because it's all one continuous mesh connected to itself, to have its own unique textile density, and then the cap should have its own as well, and then the label can have its own. So again, you want them to be as even as possible, but you also can kind of get away with finessing it a little bit. And the main thing about what I'm doing here is I'm trying to optimize the amount of space that I'm using on this map. I want my UV shells to take up as much of the space as possible, because the more wasted space that I have here where nothing is falling across the surface is space that I'm just not using in my image texture, and I want to use as much of that space up as possible, essentially. So the last thing I'll do here is I'll just scale this up, and I'll say UV, and we'll say Pack Islands one more time, and that should be fine. The majority of the space down here is dedicated to this label, and it's set up pretty well. So there we go. We have basically finished our UV layout. Let's see. I think I wanted to dissolve this edge and this edge here. Let's dissolve those. Yeah, that's fine. And then here we can finally come back here and take this label and say GX -5. And there we go, the label's over the top. So you can see we've got a good amount of density for the label there. It looks pretty dense, and then the rest of the bottle looks decent. It's got enough density there to have some decent detail, and then we're going to go from there. So in the next video, I'm going to teach you how to create additional geometry for the cap, and we're going to bake it from the duplicate of the cap that we're going to create onto the original version that we've got here. And then I'll show you some stuff in regards to material setup, baking in Blender, and we'll go from there. So I want to thank you for watching. If you've got any questions or comments, leave them down in the comment section or contact me, and I will do my best to try to help sort that out for you. Thanks for watching.